They called him the Shadow King of Seoul. Yejuan didn't negotiate, he erased. His mansion wasn't just a fortress, it was a graveyard where mercy went to die. Rule number 1, carved into every servant's contract in blood-red ink: no outsiders, no exceptions, no mercy. But on a rain-soaked Wednesday, Judy, his trembling maid, had run out of choices. The pipes had burst in her grandfather's building, flooding everything. Elias, her 76-year-old grandfather with the wooden cane and cardigan, had nowhere else to go. She smuggled him through the service entrance like a criminal smuggling contraband, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. The mansion's marble floors gleamed like ice under the chandeliers. Every shadow felt alive, watching, waiting to report her betrayal. Judy had hidden Elias in the guest wing, the forbidden corridor where no one dared breathe without permission. She'd just finished changing the linens in the east study when she heard it. The sound that haunted every servant's nightmares. The heavy front door slamming open. The deliberate, predatory footsteps echoing through the entrance hall. Steady. Unhurried. Lethal. Yejuan had returned. Judy's blood turned to ice water. She pressed herself against the wall, watching through a crack in the door as her employer emerged from the shadows. His black suit was torn at the collar. Dark stains, not his own, splattered across his crisp white shirt. His knuckles were raw, bruised, split open from whatever hell he'd just delivered to someone who'd crossed him. His face was carved from granite and rage, his eyes empty of everything except cold, efficient violence. And then she heard it. The worst sound in the world. The tap-tap-tap of a wooden cane against marble, echoing from the main hallway. No. No, no, no. Judy's legs moved before her brain caught up, running, stumbling, her cleaning apron flying behind her. She rounded the corner and her worst nightmare materialized in high definition. Elias was wandering down the grand hall, humming an old gospel hymn, completely oblivious, his weathered hand trailing along the expensive silk wallpaper, heading straight toward where Yejuan stood frozen in the entrance. Judy threw herself forward, her arms spreading wide to shield her grandfather, her body positioned between him and the Shadow King. Tears already streaming down her face, words tumbling out in desperate, broken gasps. Please, Mr. Yejuan, please, the pipes burst, he had nowhere to go, I'll leave tonight, I'll vanish, just please don't hurt him, please, he's all I have. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the gunshot, the blade, the order that would end them both. The mansion went deathly silent. No footsteps. No commands. Just the sound of expensive fabric rustling, moving, and then... thud. Judy's eyes snapped open. The Shadow King of Seoul, the man who'd once buried 3 rival bosses alive for disrespecting him, wasn't holding a weapon. He was on his knees. His head bowed in a perfect 90-degree angle of submission. And running down his stone-cold face, impossible, undeniable, were tears. Ambw, Yejuan whispered, his voice cracking like shattered glass. You're alive. Before we start, go ahead and drop a comment guessing what happened between these two, and tell us where you're watching from right now. It truly means a lot to me seeing this global Afro-Korean community grow. Every comment, every like, every share helps us bring more incredible untold stories to light, together. Why would the most feared crime lord in Seoul bow before a humble man with a wooden cane? What secret connects them? What do you think Elias did to earn this kind of loyalty from a monster? Drop your theories below, smash that like button if this hook grabbed you, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to Christine Romance Stories because this story is about to get wild. The service entrance was never locked, a calculated risk Yejuan allowed because he believed fear was a better deterrent than steel. Judy had worked in the mansion for 8 months, and she'd never once considered testing that theory. Until tonight. The rain hammered against the delivery van's windshield as she navigated the narrow alley behind the estate. Elias sat in the passenger seat, clutching his worn leather Bible, his brown cardigan soaked through despite her attempts to keep him dry. The building superintendent had called at 11 p.m., burst pipes, black mold, immediate evacuation. The elderly residents were being shuttled to a shelter across town, but Elias had refused to go. Too many strangers, he'd murmured, his hands shaking. Can't remember faces anymore, baby girl. Gets confusing. Judy had exactly $47 in her bank account and a condemned studio apartment she couldn't return to. The mansion wasn't a choice. It was the only option left when all the doors had slammed shut. She killed the engine and sat in the darkness, listening to the rain, feeling her heart trying to claw its way out of her chest. The security cameras swept the alley in precise intervals. She'd memorized the pattern months ago, not because she'd planned to break the rules, but because knowing things kept her alive in this house. 20 seconds between sweeps. That's all she had. Grandpa, she whispered, touching his weathered hand. We have to move fast and stay quiet. Can you do that for me? Elias nodded, though his eyes held that distant, cloudy quality that meant he wasn't entirely sure where he was. She grabbed his cane from the back seat, wrapped her arm around his thin frame, and moved. The service door opened with a whisper. The kitchen beyond was dark, empty, exactly as it should be at this hour. The night staff wouldn't arrive until dawn. Judy guided Elias through the shadows, past the industrial refrigerators and the butcher block island where she'd prepared Mr. Yejuan's meals in silence for 8 months, never making eye contact, never speaking unless spoken to, always invisible. They climbed the back stairs, the servants' route, narrow and steep, designed to keep the help out of sight. Elias moved slowly, each step a negotiation with his aging joints. His cane tapped softly against the wood, and each sound felt like a gunshot in the silence. The guest wing was on the 3rd floor, in the mansion's eastern corridor. No one went there. The rooms were immaculate, untouched, preserved like museum exhibits. Judy had cleaned them once a week for 8 months and never seen a single guest. Mr. Yejuan didn't entertain. He didn't have friends. He had associates, enforcers, people who delivered bad news and received worse orders in return. She settled Elias in the corner suite, the one farthest from the main house, with heavy curtains she could keep drawn. The room was larger than her grandfather's entire apartment had been, with a 4-poster bed and furniture that probably cost more than she'd make in a decade. Just for tonight, Judy whispered, helping him sit on the bed. Just until I figure something out. Please, Grandpa, please don't leave this room. Don't open the curtains. Don't. I'll be good, baby girl. Elias patted her hand, his smile gentle and confused. You worry too much. Always worrying. Just like your mama. Judy's throat closed around a sob. She kissed his forehead, pulled the curtains tight, and slipped back into the hallway. She had guest rooms to clean before sunrise. 3 on the 2nd floor that Mr. Yejuan inspected personally every morning, checking for dust with white-gloved hands, looking for any excuse to remind his staff what happened to people who disappointed him. She worked faster than she'd ever worked, her mind spinning through impossible logistics. Maybe she could find another nursing home by morning. Maybe she could borrow money from— no, she couldn't borrow money. She had no one. That's why she was here, in this beautiful nightmare of a house, working for a man whose name made grown men weep. She was polishing the brass fixtures in the 2nd floor study when she heard it. A sound that made her drop the cloth. Footsteps. Slow, uneven, accompanied by the distinct tap-tap-tap of a wooden cane. Coming from the direction of the guest wing. Judy ran. Her shoes slipped on the polished marble as she rounded the corner, and there he was. Elias, wandering down the main hallway in his cardigan and slippers, humming Amazing Grace softly to himself, his fingers trailing along the silk wallpaper like he was in his own home, like this was a Sunday morning stroll and not a death sentence. Grandpa. The word came out strangled, desperate. He turned, his face brightening. Oh, there you are, Judy. I was looking for the bathroom. This hotel has very confusing hallways. Hotel. He thought they were in a hotel. Judy grabbed his arm, trying to turn him back toward the guest wing, her words tumbling out in frantic whispers. We have to go back, we have to hide, please, Grandpa, please. The front doors exploded open. The sound was like thunder, like the world cracking open. Judy's head snapped toward the entrance hall, and every prayer she'd ever learned evaporated from her mind. Yejuan stood in the doorway, backlit by the security lights outside, rain dripping from his black suit. But it wasn't rain that stained his white shirt. The dark splatters across his collar and chest were too thick, too viscous. His knuckles were split and bleeding, the skin hanging in ragged strips. His face was a mask of cold fury, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. Behind him, 6 bodyguards filed in, their faces grim, their hands hovering near concealed weapons. Whatever had happened tonight had been brutal. The kind of brutal that left messages carved into flesh. "Get the doctor," Yejuan's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "And burn these clothes." He stopped mid-stride. His eyes locked onto Elias. The old man stood in the center of the grand hallway, leaning on his wooden cane, completely oblivious to the danger, still humming his gospel hymn. He looked so small in that massive space, so fragile and out of place, like a sparrow that had wandered into a wolf's den. Yejuan's hand moved to his waistband with the fluid precision of a predator. His fingers closed around something metallic. The bodyguards moved instantly, weapons appearing from nowhere, laser sights painting red dots across Elias's chest and forehead. Elias blinked at the lights, confused. "Oh, hello," he said, his voice warm and gentle. "I'm sorry, I think I'm a bit lost. Could you point me toward?" "Get down," one of the guards barked. "Grandpa!" Judy's scream tore through the tension. She threw herself forward, her body colliding with Elias, wrapping around him like a human shield, her arms spread wide. She could feel the laser sights on her back, burning through her uniform, marking the spots where the bullets would enter. "Please," she sobbed, looking directly at Yejuan through her tears. "Please, Mr. Yejuan, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The pipes burst, the building flooded, "He has dementia, he doesn't understand where he is. I'll leave tonight, I'll disappear, you'll never see us again, just please, please don't hurt him. He's all I have. Please." The words poured out of her like blood from a wound, desperate and incoherent, knowing they were useless but unable to stop. She pressed her face against her grandfather's cardigan, smelling the familiar scent of Old Spice and peppermint, preparing for the gunshot that would end everything. The silence stretched. No commands. No gunfire. Just the sound of rain against the windows and her own ragged breathing. Then she heard it. The rustle of expensive fabric. The soft thud of knees hitting marble. Judy's eyes flew open. Yejuan was on the floor. The Shadow King of Seoul, the man who'd once dissolved a rival's entire organization in a single night, was kneeling in the center of his entrance hall. His weapon lay discarded beside him. His hands trembled as they hung at his sides. And running down his granite face, cutting tracks through the blood spatter, were tears. "Abioji," he whispered, his voice breaking on the word. "Father. You're alive." The bodyguards froze, their weapons still trained but their fingers suddenly uncertain on the triggers. They'd followed Yejuan for years. They'd watched him execute traitors without flinching, negotiate with politicians without blinking, build an empire on the bones of anyone who opposed him. They'd never seen him hesitate. They'd never seen him cry. Judy remained frozen over her grandfather, her mind unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. The Shadow King didn't kneel. He didn't cry. He didn't. "Yejuan?" Elias's voice cut through the silence, soft and wondering. The name landed like a physical blow. Yejuan's breath hitched, his shoulders shaking with the effort of containing whatever was breaking inside him. He stared at Elias's face with an intensity that bordered on worship, like he was trying to memorize every wrinkle, every silver hair, every detail of a ghost made flesh. Elias squinted, leaning forward slightly on his cane. His cloudy eyes studied the kneeling man, and something shifted in his expression. A flicker of recognition breaking through the fog of memory. He tapped his wooden cane against the marble twice, a gesture both gentle and reprimanding. "Look at you, boy," Elias's voice carried a weight that made the guards instinctively straighten. "Still not eating right. I can see your ribs from here." The words shattered what remained of Yejuan's composure. He bent forward into a full 90-degree bow, the kind reserved for royalty, for gods, for people who owned your soul. But even that wasn't enough. He crawled forward, his expensive suit dragging across the polished stone, his pride left bleeding behind him, until he reached Elias's feet. He buried his face in the old man's weathered hands, and the sound that came from him was inhuman. A sob torn from somewhere deep and ancient, a place where he'd buried a version of himself that no one in Seoul knew existed. "I looked for you," Yejuan choked out between gasps. 15 years. I looked everywhere. They told me you were dead. They told me everyone from that ship was dead. Hush, now. Elias's fingers moved instinctively to stroke Yejuan's hair, the gesture automatic, maternal. "I'm here, son. I'm right here." The bodyguards stood like statues, their faces carefully blank, trying desperately to unsee what they were witnessing. Because the man weeping at an old man's feet wasn't the Shadow King. He was just a boy who'd lost everything and somehow, impossibly, found a piece of it again. Judy's hand slowly lowered from her face. She stared at her grandfather, then at the man sobbing into his hands, and felt reality tilting sideways. "Grandpa," she whispered. Do you know him?" But Elias just kept stroking Yejuan's hair, humming softly, and Yejuan held on tighter, as if letting go would make him disappear again. 25 years earlier. A cargo ship called the Helena, 40 miles off the coast of Somalia, carrying textiles from Ethiopia to South Korea. The hold was dark, stifling, packed with shipping containers that groaned and shifted with every wave. Elias worked the night shift as a merchant seaman, checking cargo locks and reporting any damage to the quartermaster. He'd been doing this job for 30 years. He knew every sound the ship made, every normal creak and groan. So when he heard the crying, soft, terrified, barely human, he knew immediately something was wrong. He followed the sound to container 247B, manifested as containing cotton fabric. The crying was coming from inside. Elias pressed his ear against the metal, his heart sinking. He'd heard stories. Human trafficking wasn't uncommon on cargo routes. People desperate enough to pay smugglers, smugglers corrupt enough to lock them in containers and forget about them. He ran for the bolt cutters. The container's lock snapped with a metallic crack that echoed through the hold. Elias pulled the door open, and the smell hit him first: human waste, fear, death. 3 bodies lay in the back corner, already gone. But in the front, curled into a ball behind stacks of fabric, was a boy. Maybe 10 years old. Korean, by the look of him. Skeletal, his ribs visible through papery skin. His eyes were wild with terror and dehydration, his lips cracked and bleeding. He scrambled backward when he saw Elias, making sounds like a wounded animal. "Easy, son," Elias whispered, raising his hands. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." The boy didn't understand English. Or maybe he understood but didn't believe. He just kept making those sounds, pressing himself against the metal wall like he could disappear through it. Elias slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his lunch, a piece of bread, an apple, a thermos of water. He'd been planning to eat during his break. Instead, he tore the bread in half, placed it on the container floor, and backed away. The boy stared at the food like it was a trap. Like kindness itself was something that would hurt him. "Go on," Elias said softly. "It's okay. You're safe now." It took 10 minutes before hunger overrode fear. The boy snatched the bread and devoured it, choking, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it. Elias gave him the water next, watched him drink so fast he vomited, then drink again more slowly. By sunrise, Elias had cleaned him up, hidden him in the crew quarters, and started asking questions. The boy's name was Yejuan. His parents had been killed in a gang war in Busan. His uncle, a low-level smuggler, had promised to take him to America for a better life. Instead, the uncle had sold him to traffickers for drug money and left him to die in a shipping container. The captain wanted to turn the boy over to authorities at the next port. "Not our problem," he'd said. "We report it, move on." But Elias looked at Yejuan, skinny, terrified, with eyes that had seen too much darkness for a child, and saw his own grandson's face. Judy's father had died when she was 3. Elias knew what it meant to be the only family someone had left. He spent his entire life savings, 30 years of paychecks carefully hoarded, to bribe officials and smuggle Yejuan off the ship when they docked in Los Angeles. He forged documents, created a backstory, even quit his job because staying on the Helena after helping a stowaway escape would have gotten him imprisoned or worse. For 6 months, Yejuan lived with Elias and little Judy in their cramped apartment above the laundromat. Elias taught him English using children's books. Fed him 3 meals a day until the bones stopped showing. Sat with him during nightmares, when Yejuan would wake up screaming, thinking he was back in the container. "You're safe, son," Elias would whisper, holding the trembling boy. "You're safe. I've got you." Then the uncle found them. He'd survived the gang war, crawled back from whatever hell had tried to claim him, and he wanted his nephew back. Not out of love. Out of obligation to the family business, the business that required young boys who could move through spaces adults couldn't, who could be beaten into obedience, who had no one to report to. Elias tried to fight it. Threatened to go to the police. But the uncle had connections, and Elias was just an ex-merchant seaman with forged documents harboring an illegal immigrant. The uncle made it clear, give up the boy, or everyone suffers. Including little Judy. The day they came to take Yejuan away, the boy had screamed and fought and clung to Elias like he was drowning. "Please, ambw, please don't let them take me." Elias had held him, tears streaming down his face, and whispered the last words he ever said to the boy, "Be strong, son. Be strong, and survive. And when you're big enough, when you're powerful enough, you come find me. You hear? You come find me, and we'll never be apart again." But Yejuan never came. The years passed. Elias tried to find him, wrote letters to Korean embassies, hired a private investigator who took his money and disappeared. Eventually, he accepted what everyone kept telling him, the boy was gone. Lost to the very darkness Elias had tried to save him from. Until tonight. The transformation happened with the kind of sudden violence that made the bodyguards reach for their weapons on instinct. Yejuan rose from his knees, wiping his face with the back of his hand, and turned to face his head of security, a brutal man named Khan who'd been with him for 7 years. "You aimed a weapon at him," Yejuan said quietly. Kang's face went pale. "Boss, I didn't know." "You're done. Pack your things. If I see you in Seoul by sunrise, they'll find you in the Han River. In pieces." Kang opened his mouth to protest, saw the look in Yejuan's eyes, the look that meant negotiation was off the table, and wisely chose survival. He was gone within minutes, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like a death march. Yejuan turned to the remaining guards, his voice carrying absolute authority. "This man is ambw. My father. He is untouchable. He is sacred. Anyone who disrespects him answers to me personally. Anyone who allows harm to come to him dies slowly. Understood?" "Yes, boss." The words came in unison, sharp and immediate. Yejuan knelt beside Elias again, his voice softening to something almost human. "Ambw, you'll take the master suite. Best bed, best view, anything you need." "I will not," Elias said firmly, tapping his cane against the floor. "I'm perfectly fine where I am. Don't need all that fuss." "Please," Yejuan's voice cracked on the word. "Please, let me take care of you. Let me do this one thing right." Elias studied him for a long moment, seeing past the blood and the expensive suit to the scared boy he'd pulled from a shipping container. "Fine," he said quietly. "But only because these old bones need a good mattress." Yejuan's eyes found Judy, who was still frozen against the wall, trying to process a reality that had rewritten itself in 10 minutes. "You're her granddaughter," he said. Not a question. Judy nodded, unable to speak. "Then your family." "My sister." He said it like an oath, like something binding and unbreakable. "You're done cleaning. Done hiding. You both live here now. Properly." By dawn, the mansion had been transformed into something approaching a home. The master suite was prepared with fresh flowers, new bedding, a medical alert system installed beside the bed. Judy was moved to the guest wing, her new room larger than any space she'd ever called her own. The staff whispered in confusion and terror. The devil had gone soft. The world was ending. But 3 days later, during breakfast, they learned the world had only just begun to change. Yejuan sat at the head of the dining table, his phone pressed to his ear, barking orders to a subordinate. I don't care if he's a city councilman. Break his. Crack. Elias's cane connected with Yejuan's shoulder. Language, Elias snapped. We're eating. The entire dining room went silent. The bodyguard stationed by the door stopped breathing. Yejuan, the man who'd once executed a diplomat for interrupting his lunch, rubbed his shoulder and mumbled, sorry, ambw. And sit up straight. You look like a street thug. Yes, ambw. Judy bit her lip to keep from laughing. Across the table, even the stone-faced butler's mouth twitched. That evening, Elias made Yejuan eat vegetables. Actually sat there and watched until every piece of broccoli was gone. Good boy, Elias said, patting his cheek. And Yejuan, impossibly, smiled. From that moment forward, the mansion learned a new truth: power wasn't about how many men you commanded. It was about who you were willing to bow to. But peace, it turned out, was a fragile thing. Especially when wolves were watching from the shadows, waiting for the Shadow King to show them where his heart had gone. And hearts, in Seoul's underworld, were just targets painted in blood. Lieutenant Park stood in the shadows of the third-floor landing, watching his boss, his ruthless, merciless boss, being scolded by an old man for slouching at breakfast. He watched Yejuan actually apologize. Watched him smile like a child receiving approval. And something dark twisted in Park's chest. He'd followed Yejuan for 8 years. Taken bullets for him. Buried bodies for him. Built his entire identity around being the right hand of Seoul's most feared man. He'd earned his position through loyalty proven in blood, through never questioning orders, through being the kind of violence Yejuan could deploy without hesitation. But now? Now the boss was letting some old man treat him like a child. Making decisions based on emotion instead of strategy. Showing weakness to rivals who were probably already circling like sharks who'd smelled blood in the water. Park pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number. He'd saved it 3 years ago after a territorial dispute that ended with a temporary truce, the kind of truce that meant not shooting at each other but definitely didn't mean friends. The Jade Serpent Syndicate. Yejuan's oldest rivals. Park's thumb hovered over the call button. This was treason. This was a death sentence if he got caught. But watching Yejuan bow to an old man in a cardigan, watching the Shadow King become human, felt like watching a god bleed. And gods that bleed don't deserve worship. They deserve to be replaced. He pressed call. This is Park, he said when someone answered. I have information about Yejuan. Information about a weakness you can exploit. Interested? The voice on the other end was smooth, amused. Very interested. Tell me everything. Park did. The location of the guest wing. The old man's routine. The fact that Yejuan had thrown out his best security officer for merely pointing a weapon in the grandfather's direction. He's vulnerable, Park finished. For the first time in his life, he has something he's afraid to lose. And that makes him weak. Weak, the voice repeated, savoring the word. Thank you, Lieutenant Park. You've been very helpful. We'll be in touch. The line went dead. Park stood in the shadows, phone still in his hand, and felt the weight of what he'd just done settle over him like a shroud. There was no going back now. He'd chosen his side. Across town, in a penthouse office overlooking the Han River, a man called the Viper smiled and began making calls. The Shadow King finally had a heart. Which meant, for the first time ever, he could be destroyed. Judy noticed them on a Tuesday morning while hanging laundry in the back courtyard. The black sedan parked across the street, engine idling, windows tinted dark enough to hide faces but not intention. Same car, same spot, 3 days running. Different drivers each time, but the same predatory stillness that made her skin crawl. She'd grown up in neighborhoods where you learned to recognize danger by the way it watched you. This was that kind of watching, patient, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her hands shook as she carried the laundry basket inside. She found Yejuan in his study, reviewing financial reports with the kind of cold focus that had built his empire. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted immediately. He'd become attuned to fear in the weeks since Elias had arrived, not the fear his enemies showed, but the fear of people he'd sworn to protect. "What's wrong?" "There's a car," Judy said, setting the basket down with trembling hands. "Black sedan. Been watching the house for 3 days." Yejuan was at the window before she finished speaking, his phone already at his ear. His jaw tightened as he studied the vehicle through the curtains. "Run the plates on the black sedan, northeast corner." "Now." The response came back in 90 seconds. The car was registered to a shell corporation, layers of paperwork designed to hide ownership, but Yejuan had people who could peel back those layers like skin from bone. The trail led to the Jade Serpent Syndicate. The Vipers organization. Yejuan's knuckles went white around his phone. He'd been expecting this, hoping against hope it wouldn't come, but expecting it all the same. Happiness in his world always came with a price tag written in blood. He found Elias in the garden, sitting on a stone bench in the afternoon sun, watching birds fight over seeds he'd scattered. The old man looked peaceful, content, completely unaware that vultures of a different kind were circling overhead. "Abog," Yejuan said quietly, sitting beside him. "We need to talk." Elias looked up, and his cloudy eyes sharpened with the kind of clarity that came and went like tides. "Something's wrong. I'm sending you and Judy away tonight. I have a safe house in Jeju, isolated, secure. You'll be comfortable there until—" "No." The word was simple, absolute, delivered with the same tone Elias had used when scolding Yejuan for cursing at the breakfast table. Yejuan blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Abog, you don't understand. These people are dangerous. They found out about you, and they'll use you to get to me. I can handle them, but only if I know you're safe. Please." "No," Elias repeated, reaching over to take Yejuan's hand. The same hand that had broken bones and ended lives now rested in weathered fingers that had once shared their last piece of bread with a dying boy. "I lost you once, son. Spent 30 years thinking you were dead, wondering if I could have done more, saved you better. I'm not losing you again. They'll use you against me. Then you'd better make sure they don't succeed." Elias's eyes held a determination that transcended the dementia, the age, the frailty. "I didn't raise a boy who runs from fights. And I certainly didn't survive 78 years on this earth just to hide in some beach house while my son faces danger alone." Yejuan felt something crack in his chest. "You'll die. We all die, Yejuan. Question is whether we die as cowards or as family." Elias squeezed his hand. "I'm staying." End of discussion. Judy appeared in the garden doorway, her expression resolute despite the fear in her eyes. "I'm staying too." "Judy?" "He's my grandfather," she said firmly. "And you're family now." "I'm not running either." Yejuan looked between them, these two people who'd somehow become his entire world in 3 weeks, and felt the weight of a choice he'd never wanted to make. He could force them to leave. He had the men, the resources, the authority. But looking at Elias's face, seeing the echo of that container, that apartment, that promise they'd made to each other 25 years ago, he understood. Some battles you don't fight alone, even when fighting alone is safer. "Then we prepare," Yejuan said quietly. "And we survive. Together." Outside, in the black sedan, a camera clicked, capturing the 3 of them in the garden. The photo was sent to a phone number with no name attached, and across town, the Viper smiled. The attack came 3 nights later, during the window between midnight and dawn when the world was at its darkest and human instinct was at its weakest. Yejuan had tripled security, guards on every floor, cameras monitoring every angle, panic rooms reinforced and tested. He'd turned his mansion into a fortress. But fortresses can be breached when someone on the inside opens the door. Lieutenant Park waited until the shift change at 2 a.m., when the guards were transitioning and attention was fractured. He walked to the servants' entrance, the same entrance Judy had used to smuggle Elias inside, and disabled the alarm. Simple. Quiet. Treason that took less than 30 seconds. The Jade Serpent strike team moved like smoke through the opening. 12 men, professionally trained, carrying weapons that could punch through the mansion's walls like tissue paper. They split into 3 groups, one for the security room, one for Yejuan's quarters, one heading straight for the guest wing where an old man in a cardigan slept soundly, unaware he'd become the bait in a trap designed to destroy a king. The first explosion came from the security room, a flashbang that took out the camera feeds and half the guards monitoring them. Yejuan was awake instantly, his training overriding the brief disorientation of being ripped from sleep. He rolled out of bed, grabbed the weapon from his nightstand, and was moving before his conscious mind caught up with his body. Gunfire erupted from the ground floor. The distinctive crack of assault rifles, answered by the deeper boom of his guards' shotguns. Yejuan's mind raced through calculations, attackers, positions, objectives. They were here for Elias. Everything else was distraction. He burst into the hallway wearing nothing but sleep pants and determination, his weapon raised. 2 of his guards were already down, blood pooling on the marble. 3 attackers were advancing up the main stairs. Yejuan didn't hesitate. He fired 3 times, center mass, the way he'd been trained since he was 15. 2 men dropped. The third dove for cover, spraying bullets wildly. Get to the guest wing. Yejuan roared at the remaining guards. Protect ambw. But even as he said it, he heard the gunfire coming from that direction. They were already there. Yejuan ran. Bullets chewed through the walls beside him, sending plaster dust and splinters into the air. He returned fire without aiming, providing suppression while he moved, his mind focused on a single objective: reach Elias before they did. He took the stairs 3 at a time, sliding around the corner on the second-floor landing. A guard's body lay crumpled against the wall, and through the smoke and chaos, Yejuan could see the guest wing doors blown open, hanging crooked on their hinges. His heart stopped. He covered the distance in seconds that felt like hours, his weapon raised, preparing for the worst. The hallway beyond was a war zone. 2 more of his guards down. Bullet holes in the walls. And at the end of the corridor, silhouetted against the emergency lighting, was Judy. She stood in the doorway to Elias's room, her arms spread wide, a wooden chair leg gripped in her shaking hands like a weapon. Her maid's uniform was torn, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes blazed with a fury that transcended fear. "You don't touch him," she screamed at the 3 attackers advancing on her position. "You want him, you go through me." One of the attackers raised his weapon, aiming at the unarmed woman blocking his objective. Yejuan's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The other 2 turned, weapons swinging toward Yejuan, and the hallway exploded into violence. Yejuan moved like the devil they called him, fast, efficient, merciless. He put down one attacker with 2 shots, ducked behind a marble column as return fire shattered the stone. His magazine was empty. He ejected it, slammed a fresh one home, and pivoted out from cover. The 3rd attacker had reached Judy. He grabbed her, using her body as a shield, his weapon pressed against her temple. "Drop it," he shouted in Korean. "Drop it or she dies." Yejuan froze. His weapon trained on the man's head, but the angle was wrong, the risk too high. One flinch, one miscalculation, and Judy's blood would paint the walls. "Smart," the attacker said, breathing hard. "Now back up." Let me through, or I paint this hallway with her. A wooden cane cracked across the back of his skull. The attacker staggered, his grip on Judy loosening. Elias stood behind him in his cardigan and pajama pants, his cane raised for another strike, his face twisted with a righteous fury that transcended his 78 years. "Get your hands off my granddaughter," Elias roared. The distraction cost the attacker everything. Yejuan's bullet took him in the head before he could recover, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Judy collapsed, gasping, and Elias caught her, pulling her close. Yejuan rushed forward, his weapon still raised, sweeping the hallway for more threats. "Are you hurt? Either of you?" "We're okay," Judy sobbed. "Grandpa, you shouldn't have." "Hush," Elias murmured, stroking her hair. "I'm old, not useless." The moment of relief shattered as gunfire erupted from the main stairwell. More attackers, pushing through Yejuan's defensive line. They were still coming. Yejuan grabbed Elias's arm, trying to pull him toward the panic room at the end of the hall. "We have to move. Now." But Elias pulled back, his eyes finding Yejuan's. Clear. Present. Seeing everything. "Where do we run to, son? You think these men stop because we hide? You think your enemies forget? I think I keep you alive." Yejuan's voice cracked. "That's all that matters." "No." Elias's hand cupped Yejuan's face, the same way he had 25 years ago when a terrified boy woke from nightmares of shipping containers and death. "What matters is we stand together. What matters is you remember who you are. Not the devil they call you. Not the monster you became. But the boy who promised to find me. The son I raised to be strong." Footsteps thundered up the stairs. Multiple attackers, coordinating their assault. Yejuan's remaining guards were falling back, outnumbered and outgunned. The mansion that had been his fortress was becoming his tomb. Unless he became the devil one more time. Yejuan released Elias, checked his weapon, and stepped into the hallway. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "Both of you. No matter what happens, you stay behind me." Four attackers rounded the corner in tactical formation, weapons raised. Yejuan didn't give them time to acquire targets. He opened fire, his shots precise despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. One man down. 2. The others scattered for cover, returning fire that forced Yejuan back into the guest wing doorway. He was bleeding. He didn't know from where, there was too much adrenaline, too much chaos to feel individual wounds. His shirt was wet with it, sticky and warm. But pain was just information, and information could be ignored when survival demanded it. He ejected his empty magazine, reached for another, and found nothing. He was out. The attackers realized it at the same moment he did. They emerged from cover, advancing with the confidence of men who knew their target was defenseless. "It's over, Shadow King," one of them called in Korean. "Come out, and we make it quick. Hide, and everyone dies slow." Yejuan looked at the empty weapon in his hands, then back at Elias and Judy huddled behind him. He'd fought his entire life to build power, to become untouchable, to ensure no one could ever hurt him the way his uncle had, the way the traffickers had, the way the world had when he was small and helpless. But power meant nothing if you had no one to protect. He dropped the weapon and stepped into the hallway, his hands raised. Drawing their attention. Drawing their aim. Giving Elias and Judy precious seconds to run, to hide, to survive. "You want me?" Yejuan called out, his voice steady despite the blood loss making the world tilt. "Here I am. Let them go, and I'll come quietly." The lead attacker smiled. "We don't want you, Shadow King. We want him." He aimed past Yejuan, toward where Elias stood in the doorway. "The old man dies. You watch." That's the message. That's what happens when devils pretend they can love. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the confined space. But it wasn't the attacker who fired. Lieutenant Park stood at the end of the hallway, his weapon smoking, and the lead attacker collapsed with a hole in his chest. Park's face was pale, his hands shaking, but his aim was steady as he trained his weapon on the remaining attackers. "I'm sorry," Park said, his voice hoarse. "Boss, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was." The attackers opened fire on this new threat. Park went down hard, his body jerking with impacts. But his sacrifice bought Yejuan the seconds he needed. Yejuan dove for the fallen attacker's weapons, came up firing, and the hallway became a slaughterhouse. He moved with the kind of violence that had earned him his title: precise, brutal, unstoppable. One attacker tried to run. Yejuan's bullet caught him in the spine. Another raised his hands in surrender. Yejuan shot him anyway. Mercy was for people who hadn't threatened his family. The last attacker, wounded and desperate, swung his weapon toward Elias one final time. The old man stood there, cane in hand, defiant even in the face of death. Yejuan threw himself forward, his body crossing the space between the gunman and his father just as the trigger was pulled. The bullet hit him in the chest, just below his left shoulder. White-hot agony exploded through his torso, and his legs gave out. He crashed to the marble floor, blood spreading beneath him in a dark pool that reflected the emergency lights. "Yejuan!" Elias's scream cut through the ringing in his ears. The old man dropped his cane and fell to his knees beside Yejuan, his weathered hands pressing against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "No, no, no. Stay with me, son. Stay with me." Judy appeared, her phone pressed to her ear, screaming for an ambulance. More guards were arriving now, securing the mansion, too late to stop the attack but in time to witness its aftermath. Yejuan looked up at Elias through vision that was starting to gray at the edges. The old man was crying, his tears falling onto Yejuan's face like rain. "I'm sorry," Yejuan whispered, tasting copper. "I promised I'd protect you. Promised I'd be strong enough." "You are strong enough," Elias sobbed, cradling Yejuan's head in his lap. "You're the strongest person I know. You came back. You found me. That's all that matters. Didn't want to lose you again. You won't. You hear me? You survived a shipping container. You survived being alone. You survived becoming the man you had to become. You're going to survive this." The world was fading, sounds becoming distant. But Yejuan could still feel Elias's hands, still hear his voice, still remember the container and the bread and the promise. He'd spent 25 years becoming a monster so he'd never be helpless again. But in the end, the strongest thing he'd ever done was let himself be vulnerable enough to love. "Aboji," he whispered. "I'm here, son. I'm right here." And for the first time since he was 10 years old, Yejuan stopped fighting and let himself be held. Consciousness returned in fragments. Pain first, sharp and immediate, centered in his chest and radiating outward like fire through his nerves. Then sound. Machines beeping, hushed voices speaking Korean and English. Then sensation, soft sheets, the weight of blankets, and a weathered hand holding his own. Yejuan's eyes opened to white ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights. Hospital. He tried to sit up, and the pain nearly sent him back into darkness. "Easy," Judy's voice came from beside the bed. "You were in surgery for 6 hours. Doctor said you're lucky the bullet missed your heart by 2 inches. Lucky. That was one word for it." Yejuan turned his head, fighting through the morphine fog, and found Elias sitting in a chair beside the bed. The old man looked exhausted, his cardigan wrinkled, his eyes red from crying. But he was alive. Unharmed. That was all that mattered. "How long?" Yejuan's voice came out as a rasp. 3 days, Elias said quietly. "You've been in and out." "Mostly out." 3 days. Yejuan's mind tried to catalog everything that must have happened in that time. The cleanup, the police, the inevitable questions about why a mansion in Seoul's wealthiest district had become a war zone. The Viper? Dead, Judy said simply. Your people found him 6 hours after the attack. Sent what was left to his organization as a message. Yejun closed his eyes, letting that information settle. The threat was over. His family was safe. The cost had been blood and bullets, and a lieutenant who'd betrayed him then died trying to earn redemption. The cost was always high in his world. But for the first time, he'd paid it for something that mattered. Park? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Didn't make it, Judy said softly. Took 4 bullets covering your position. He tried to apologize. In the end. Yejun nodded slowly. Betrayal and redemption, measured in blood and sacrifice. He'd order a proper burial, make sure Park's family was taken care of. It wouldn't fix what the lieutenant had done, but it would honor what he'd tried to become in his final moments. Elias squeezed his hand, and Yejun's eyes opened again. The old man was studying him with an expression that held too many emotions to name. You took a bullet for me, Elias said quietly. Threw yourself in front of a gun to save a useless old man. You're not useless. I'm not worth your life. Yes, you are. Yejun's voice was firm despite the weakness in his body. You're worth more than any empire I could build. More than any power I could take. You're worth everything, ambw. You always were. Elias's composure finally broke. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against their joined hands, and wept. Not the controlled tears of relief, but the deep, racking sobs of a man releasing 30 years of grief and guilt and love he'd thought was lost forever. I thought I'd failed you, Elias choked out. Let them take you back to Korea, let you become this dark thing. I thought I'd ruined you by not being strong enough to keep you safe. You saved me, Yejun said, his own eyes burning. Everything I became, every terrible thing I did, it was because I was trying to become strong enough that no one could ever hurt me again. Strong enough to find you. Strong enough to protect you if I did. You didn't fail me, ambw. You gave me a reason to survive. Judy stood quietly in the corner, tears streaming down her face as she watched her grandfather and this man she'd once feared reconcile with a past that had shaped them both into who they were. So what happens now? She asked softly. You can't go back to what you were. Not after this. The whole city knows the Shadow King has a heart now. Yejun looked at her, then at Elias, and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had nothing to do with bullet wounds and everything to do with choice. Then the Shadow King dies, he said quietly. Let them bury that name with the bodies in my mansion. I'm done being a devil. You're a crime boss, Yejun, Judy said gently. You can't just walk away from that. No, Yejun agreed. But I can change what it means. The empire didn't collapse. Empires built on fear rarely do. But over the following months, it transformed into something Seoul's underworld had never seen before. Yejun kept his organization, his soldiers, his network of power that stretched through the city like roots. But the violence became surgical, targeted only at those who preyed on the vulnerable. The trafficking operations he'd once ignored were dismantled, their operators found in pieces. The loan sharks who destroyed families were given a choice. Forgive the debts or join their victims in ruin. The protection rackets became actual protection, small business owners paid for security that actually kept them safe, not for the privilege of not being terrorized by the very people they paid. The drug trade was redirected away from schools, and dealers who sold to children simply disappeared. The city called it mercy. Yejun called it repayment. Because every child he saved from a shipping container, every family he protected from predators, every person he gave a second chance, they were all echoes of a terrified 10-year-old boy and the merchant seaman who'd shared his last piece of bread. Elias lived in the mansion, treated like royalty by guards who'd once aimed weapons at him. He walked the gardens, fed birds, and scolded Yejun for working too hard and not eating enough vegetables. The dementia remained, stealing memories and clarity in unpredictable waves. But even when he didn't remember Yejuan's name, he remembered the feeling, the bone-deep knowledge that he was loved. Judy left the maid's uniform behind and became Yejuan's legitimate business manager, handling the operations that could survive daylight scrutiny. She was terrifyingly good at it, with a mind for numbers and a moral compass that Yejuan relied on to keep him from sliding back into the darkness. On quiet evenings, the three of them would sit in the garden together. Yejuan would report on his day, the businesses acquired, the threats neutralized, the people helped. Elias would nod approvingly or frown and rap his cane when something crossed the line into territory he didn't approve of. Judy would tally numbers and make plans and remind them both that family meant more than empire. And sometimes, when the sun set just right and the world was peaceful, Yejuan would close his eyes and remember. The container. The bread. The promise. The Shadow King was dead, they said. Killed in the attack that had left his mansion a war zone and his enemies in pieces. What they didn't understand was something more dangerous had risen from those ashes. Not a king. Not a devil. Just a son who'd learned that true power wasn't the ability to destroy. It was the courage to protect. 1 year after the attack, on a warm spring evening, Elias sat on the garden bench watching the sunset. His mind was clear today, one of the good days when the fog lifted and he could see the world with perfect clarity. Yejuan sat beside him, his chest still carrying the scar from the bullet that had nearly ended everything. "You turned out good, you know," Elias said quietly. "Despite everything. Despite what they tried to make you. You turned out to be exactly the man I knew you could be." Yejuan felt his throat close around emotions he'd spent decades suppressing. "I'm still a criminal, a BOG. Still have blood on my hands. Still do things that would horrify you if you knew the details." "Maybe," Elias agreed. "But you do them for the right reasons now. That's what matters. Not the darkness you walk through, but who you're protecting while you do it." Judy appeared with tea, setting the tray on the stone table. She'd started dressing better. Trading her maid's uniform for business suits that made her look like the executive she'd become. But she still checked on Elias every hour, still made sure he took his medicine, still loved him with the same fierce devotion she'd shown when she threw herself in front of armed men to protect him. "To family," Yejuan said, raising his cup. "To second chances," Judy added, raising hers. "To coming home," Elias finished, his eyes clear and bright and full of love. They drank together as the sun set over Seoul, three people who'd found each other across decades and darkness and impossible odds. A merchant seaman who'd shared his last piece of bread. A crime lord who'd learned to bow. A granddaughter who'd discovered that family wasn't about blood, it was about who you were willing to die for. The city would always have its devils, its shadows, its places where light couldn't reach. But in one mansion, in one garden, around one stone table, there was proof that even devils could be redeemed. All it took was someone brave enough to see the boy inside the monster and love him anyway. All it took was a wooden cane, a cardigan, and a promise made in a shipping container 25 years ago. All it took was family. And family, Yejuan had finally learned, was worth every bullet, every scar, every impossible choice. It was worth everything.